The United States Army USA is the largest branch of the United States Armed Forces as well as the oldest. It serves as the land component of the United States Armed Forces. It was first formed in 1775 as the Continental Army, and today is made up of 1 million men who serve in the regular Army, Army Reserve, and Army National Guard. It is the responsibility of the Army, as the major land service of the armed forces, to carry out activities related to ground combat. The Department of the Army is a military department that is in charge of organizing the United States Army. The Secretary of the Army and the Assistant Secretary of the Army are in charge of the Department of the Army. The Chief of Staff of the Army and the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, both of whom are generals, lead the United States Army. The Chief of Staff of the Army and the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army are both advised by the Sergeant Major of the Army. As a component of the Joint Force, the primary task of the Army is to undertake land warfare that is both prompt and sustained. The primary goals of Army land power are the subjugation of an adversary's will, the occupation of their territory, and the destruction of their military forces. Here are the 5 primary areas of expertise possessed by the Army. Asterisk combat on the ground that is both prompt and sustained. Asterisk operations involving multiple arms. Asterisk combined military maneuvering and security over a vast area. Asterisk operations involving both armor and machinery. Asterisk operations involving airborne and aerial assault. Asterisk operations are specific to. Asterisk establish and maintain the battlefield for the combined force. Power on land should be integrated at the national, multinational, and joint levels. To defeat enemy ground troops and take, occupy, and defend land areas, it is necessary to conduct fast and persistent combined arms combat operations on land in all settings and types of terrain, including complicated urban contexts. Carry out air and missile defense operations to bolster combined campaigns and contribute to gaining air superiority. The Army's Air Defense Artillery Branch is in charge of this operation. More precisely, the 10th Army Air and Missile Defense Command, the 32nd Army Air and Missile Defense Command, the 94th Army Air and Missile Defense Command, the 263rd Army Air and Missile Defense Command, and the Army Space and Missile Defense Command are also involved. Carry out airborne and air assault operations as well as amphibious maneuvers. The Army is primarily responsible for the formulation of airborne doctrine, as well as airborne tactics, techniques, and operating procedures. The XVI Airborne Corps of the 11th Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne Division, and the 173rd Airborne Brigade are the components of the Army that are responsible for carrying out airborne and air assault missions. Carry out operations related to civil affairs. The United States Army Special Operations Command is the organization responsible for carrying out civil affairs operations. These activities are primarily carried out by the United States Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Activities Command and the 95th Civil Affairs Brigade. Carry out operations in riverine environments. Occupy areas overseas and make beginning preparations for the installation of a military government in the interim before transferring authority for these regions to other authorities. Conduct operations on the land and from the land to interdict the sea power, space power, air power, and communications of the enemy. Assist in the planning and execution of joint operations and campaigns, including the coordination of the over-the-shore and in-theater transit of time-sensitive and mission-critical personnel and supplies. This is mostly handled by the Army Logistics Branch, which is comprised of the Quartermaster Corps, Ordnance Corps, and Transportation Corps, as well as the Military Surface Deployment and Distribution Command of the Army Materiel Command. Provide support to space operations to enhance joint campaigns. This is to be done in conjunction with the other branches of the armed forces, mainly the United States Space Force, combatant commands, particularly the United States Space Command, and other departments and agencies of the United States government. The Army Space and Missile Defense Command is in charge of running all of the Army's space operations. Conduct permitted civil works programs, including projects for the improvement of navigation, flood control, beach erosion control, and other water resource developments in the United States, its territories, and its possessions, as well as conduct other civil activities mandated by law. In addition, the United States must maintain its possessions and territories. The Army Corps of Engineers is the organization in charge of this. Ensure that there is access to in-theater aeromedical evacuation. Both the Army Medical Service Corps and the Army Aviation Branch are responsible for flying these missions. Conduct reconnaissance, surveillance, and target acquisition. Maintain the functionality of the communication landlines. The Transportation Corps and the Military Surface Deployment and Distribution Command are the primary organizations responsible for carrying this out. Departments of Service. There are 6 distinct but equal branches of the armed forces that make up the United States Armed Forces. The United States Army, the United States Marine Corps, the United States Navy, the United States Air Force, and the United States Space Force are the 5 branches of the United States Armed Forces that are organized under the military departments of the Department of Defense. The United States Coast Guard is officially part of the Department of Homeland Security, but it has the potential to be transferred to the Department of the Navy inside the Department of Defense. The Department of the Navy is the civilian institution that oversees the co-equal United States Marine Corps and United States Navy. This transfer might take place at the command of either the President or the Congress. The military services are only responsible for organizing, training, and providing equipment to the armed forces, except the Coast Guard. It is the responsibility of the Unified Combatant Commands to exercise operational authority over the non-service retained troops. A role and a sphere of responsibility have been delegated to each of the branches of the armed forces. The United States Army is in charge of land operations, while the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps are responsible for marine operations. The Marine Corps specializes in amphibious and maritime littoral operations in support of the Navy, while the Navy is in charge of land operations. Operations in the air are handled by the United States Air Force, while those in space are handled by the United States Space Force. The United States Coast Guard is one of a kind since it serves both as an enforcement agency and a military arm that specializes in naval and marine operations. Structure. Article 2 of the Constitution names the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. This establishes presidential leadership over the United States Armed Forces and gives the President ultimate authority over the military. The Department of Defense is the major cabinet department responsible for military matters, while the Department of Homeland Security is in charge of the administration of the United States Coast Guard. Together, these 2 departments make up the United States Armed Forces. To maintain civilian control over the armed forces, the chain of command for the United States military runs from the President of the United States to either the Secretary of Defense for services that fall under the Department of Defense, or the Secretary of Homeland Security for services that fall under the Department of Homeland Security. Within the Department of Defense, the military departments, the Department of the Army, the United States Department of the Navy, and the Department of the Air Force are civilian-led bodies that supervise the equal military service branches that are structured within each department. The actual chain of command is structured so that it flows through the Unified Combatant Commands. Nonetheless, it is the responsibility of the military departments and services to organize, train, and equip the forces. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is the senior-most military body in the United States Armed Forces. This position is equivalent to the head of the United States Armed Forces and serves as the primary military counselor to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the position that reports to them. Other members include the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Commandant of the Army, the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief of Space Operations, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and the Chief of the National Guard Bureau. Although the Commandant of the Coast Guard is not an official member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he does occasionally sit in on meetings in his capacity as the head of one of the armed services. The position of Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman is held by the enlisted service member who has the most seniority in the United States Armed Forces. If you like it, kindly give your valuable response in our comment section below and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting and informative videos.